Okay, we're good.
Anybody else coming? Is there anybody else out there? Okay. I guess we'll go ahead. I doubt it, but just in case. Let's go ahead and get started, and then you can go ahead and we'll get done earlier, right? Dates. Anybody need any of the dates?
All of them.
Oh, man. Do you not have your review from last time that has all the exact same dates on it?
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's the same date?
Yeah. Except for 1453. Uh-oh. This is not a good sign. 1453. Anybody?
The first. Oh, when the.
Fall of.
No.
All right, 1453, the fall of Constantinople, or excuse me, yes, fall of Constantinople, I get them confused, to the Ottoman Turks and Mehmet II, and then 1492. Yeah, so that one's an easy one. So, identify the leaders and dynasties that ruled China. So I went ahead and I extended it out past the 1270s because we're going to talk about them all anyway. Sui dynasty had two people, father and son, and the son killed the father. Anybody happen to remember who that is?
Wendy.
Wendy and Yangdi.
Good job.
All right, so, and that's it. What? Wendy is the father. Because it's only a 27-year dynasty anyway, it's just the two of them. And then eventually Yangdi is killed, and he is replaced by the Tang dynasty, Tang Taizong. Okay. Now, what did they disagree about? Just real quick before we move on to the next dynasty. They disagreed about something. The son disagreed with the father about his policy of... Yeah, it's about the bureaucracy, right? The father wanted to make the nomads happy just so they would stop attacking, right? Because they were attacking when there was no emperor, and they were making inroads into China. So he thought, let's try to get the nomads to be our friends. And Yangdi was like, the nomads will never be your friends, right? He has the typical view that they are barbarians. And he says, what you need is the scholar gentry. You need to get the government up and running again. You need to get that running like it used to be. And that was the disagreement. So we have Tang Taizong. We also have a lady during the Tang Dynasty who would like to install Buddhism. Empress Wu, right? And these are all dying. And then we have the person who came after Empress Wu, who basically undid everything that she did. And his name was Emperor Wuzong. So if you can remember Wu and Wuzong, you put those two together. They are not related. But Wu wants Buddhism. Wuzong is willing to attack and persecute the Buddhists, right? Then we have a brief period of time in here where there is no clear emperor. The person in 960 for the Song dynasty who eventually rebuilds the government. Let's see. I'm going to have to shift to blue. Actually, there's not a D. Zhao Kuan-yin. And then the Yuan dynasty is under the leadership of which group? This is the Mongols, right? Okay. And that is obviously Kublai Khan. And then the Ming dynasty that comes after, the ones responsible for throwing the Mongols out of China, are led by So I would make a chart, and I would do whatever I could to try to put the names into a timeline almost, right? Because this is first, that's next, that's next, that's next, that's next. And the more you categorize the names, the more likely you are to be able to remember them. You're not going to have that many questions that say, who was the leader of the Yuan dynasty? You know that you only get that little short section of pretty much straightforward multiple choice questions. But understanding what's going on, what kind of debates they're having here, what's the problem here, what's the problem there, it's kind of connecting people to the concepts, and that's what's going to be able to help you answer those stimulus-based questions that you get a lot, right? Describe the status of China between the Han Dynasty, so this period right in here, where the Han comes to an end, and that's a date you have to memorize. That's on there. When does the Han come to an end? Somebody said it, I think.
220.
What'd you say? 220?
I got it in class.
And then, so from 220 to 589, you don't have an emperor, right? So what's going on in this time period right here? How can we characterize this period other than no emperor? Do they have bureaucrats? They kind of do, but the bureaucrats don't work for the government anymore. There's no emperor to work for, right? So the bureaucrats go to work for the aristocratic families who give them land, and instead of just being your run-of-the-mill bureaucrat, they become what? What's the new name of the bureaucrats who have land? Scholar gentry, right? So we're going to see the rise of the scholar gentry here, and that's what Wendy and Yang Di are disagreeing about, is whether to use those scholar gentry or not, right? You also have nobody to really keep ideas out. So you have a flow of what? What's an idea that comes during this time into China for the first time? A religious idea. Buddhism, right? And that Buddhism that's being introduced here is what Empress Wu is trying to make kind of a state religion. She's not going to be successful. All of China does not become Buddhist because there is kind of a backlash against that. And that's kind of when you begin to see neo-Confucianists who would like to see China be for Chinese people, be very xenophobic. They're going to be very mistrustful of foreign ideas. That's when you're really going to start to see the rise of the neo-Confucianists.
Just a point a little bit.
Yeah.
Why did there between the Han and the Sui? Why did bureaucrats begin to own land again?
Because they worked for aristocratic families, and aristocratic families didn't have money because they didn't tax people, but what they had was land.
Okay.
So they gave land to them, and they said, you can live off this land, and then peasants who live on your land will grow crops for you, and that's essentially a feudalistic arrangement. All right, so what changes in government did the Sui and Tang dynasties initiate? Essentially, they brought back the civil service exams. They brought back the bureaucracy, okay? There was an attempt to make Buddhism part of that, but that didn't actually become successful in the end. So that was another change, right? But we also know that they are becoming much more neo-Confucianist, and we see this kind of xenophobic attitude, this anti-foreign attitude. What do the Chinese ministries do? Ministries were developed during this time also, because the government is becoming much more complex. You have a much larger population. Remember, by the end of the Han Dynasty, we were talking about 65 million Chinese people. By the beginning of the Sui, it's 80 million. And then it's like 120, and by the Ming Dynasty, it's like 300 million people. So, as more people, you need a larger, more complex government. You need more layers, right? So the ministries then were given parts of government to work on. So they were splitting up the work that needed to be done to govern 80, 120, or 300 million people, right? Ministry of War, they focused on making war, right? Ministry of Rights, which focused on having the exams ready so they could determine who the next bureaucrats would be and pass, do the exams and all of that stuff. That was a new layer of complex level of government. Who are the Jinshi then? The Jinshi are the people who pass the new level of tests. Because now instead of just being one test here, there's going to be two tests. And that second one is more of a literature exam. It's a little tougher, requires more of a knowledge of Chinese culture and history. And if you can pass that test, you most likely directly work for the emperor. You will not work out in a province somewhere very far away from the capital. You will be in the capital, which means you'll have more access to the emperor and you'll have more influence and power. So the Jinshi were people who passed two levels of exams and became very high-ranking bureaucrats. What social groups were attracted to the various forms of Buddhism? This is not really going to be a big thing, but just understand that Buddhism takes on many forms. So upper-class people who had leisure time and who were relatively educated and intelligent were attracted to Zen Buddhism because it required lots of rituals and it kind of required a certain knowledge base. So Zen, Z-E-N Buddhism, is a major form of Buddhism for the aristocrats and the wealthy people. Mahayana Buddhism, which encouraged kind of withdrawal from society, was a favorite among the monks, Buddhist monks and so on, because they were seeing a lot of fighting going on. There was no emperor, so there was a lot of chaos. There were nomadic groups that were attacking China. There was lots of changes going on, and the monks were seeking kind of a refuge from a time of chaos, right? So Mahayana Buddhism provided them a way to kind of withdraw from society. So monks mainly followed like a Mahayana Buddha form of Buddhism. Empress Wu's reign, she tried to install Buddhism as the state religion. How did people react? Were most people on board with her, or were they against her? You're saying no, right? Most people were against her. Most people wanted China to be for Chinese people, not for some foreign idea. Neo-Confucianists were not happy. Taoists weren't happy, right? They were seeing land being taken away and given to people who were from not China, but from somewhere else, right? So the reaction was that there was a severe backlash, and eventually Emperor Wuzong did reclaim most of that land given to Buddhist monasteries. Let's see. What problems did the Song dynasty? So Sui is trying to reestablish, right? We're trying to recreate a government. We need to know what to do. Fundamental questions of government. The Tang dynasty then is Buddhism versus Confucianism. Which one are we going to go with, right? Song dynasty, what's the major problem? What's the conflict? What are they worried about the most? Right? What do we do about the nomads? We got to bribe them. That didn't work. We got to get a peasant army. Well, the peasants don't fight very well, so that's not good. We got to get mercenaries. Oh, they're costly. And when you don't pay them, they tend to revert to the other side and attack you, right? So during this time, what you see is the creation of two dynasties in northern China that are inside the Great Wall, but are nomadic, and they are not Chinese. So you have the Tangut Kingdom, and you have the Jin or the Qin dynasty, not the same one as Qin Shi Huangdi, but these two dynasties. So if these two dynasties are able to establish themselves inside the Great Wall, and they can hang out and they can be like a thorn in the side of the Chinese government, who else is going to follow their lead? Who else is going to attack them and then China after that? Mongols, right? So all of that is leading to a nomadic problem with the Mongols. And they are successful, which means the Yuan dynasty is about trying to make Chinese people accept a Mongolian overlord, right, Kublai Khan, and then the desire to fight back against them and restore China to its original state, right? So this is about acceptance. So if you get a question that talks about Empress Wu, and one of your answers is she was having to deal with the nomadic problem and come to terms with accepting a Mongol overlord, is that going to even be an answer you want? Right? So if you can categorize these things and come up with very quick, like the bumper sticker quote for each dynasty, right? Then you can connect the names to the bumper sticker quote, the concept that's going on, and you can keep those straight. Because that's the hardest part on this test, is usually keeping all the names straight, right? Let's see, what problems did the Song dynasty? That's the nomads. What are the dynasties? Tangut and Jin, okay? Comparisons between the Tang and Song dynasty. Which one is more politically powerful? Which one has more governmental control? The Tang dynasty, because what did the Song dynasty, what does it do eventually when these two dynasties come into play? They go, yeah, they split and they go to the south, right? They give up territory. Does that sound like they're politically powerful? No. Right? And they didn't solve the problem, right? So politically, Tang is more powerful. It's larger physically because they haven't given up territory. Which one's having a cultural renaissance, though? Because they stop paying for peasant armies and mercenaries and bribes. And they keep that money, and you have northern and southern Chinese coming together because of the Grand Canal, which is in full swing by the Song, even though it was started during the Tang dynasty, right? That's when you have those ideas coming together. You have more people living in cities. The ideas tend to spread faster because of cultural diffusion. And you actually see a stronger social development here. Even though we've already kind of talked about how China has kind of a golden age starting in the 8th century, which is kind of in the middle here, right? But it's really going to be more pronounced during the Song Dynasty. The Grand Canal allowed people to go from the north to the south, right? From northern China to southern China. How did it affect economics? Well, it made China be powerful along the coastline. It made the southern part be more powerful than the northern part, which is a characteristic of what? Southernization, right? Society. They were getting more strict about women. What were they making women do? Foot binding. Culturally, though, they were taking off. The elites were producing more ideas and things like that because they were more focused on that than fighting nomads, right? Why were the Song fleeing? Nomads. You already have that. What are the impacts of the flight to the south? Actually, that kind of duplicates, so we already just covered that, right? Economic developments, specific economic developments that occur during the Tong and Song. So what are some things that allow people to trade longer distances? Boats, but they're not called boats. Junks. Oh, come on. Do I have to tear another one?
Paper money.
Paper money. Flying money. Same thing. You can also include guilds, although that's not necessarily just a Chinese invention, but where merchants work together to reduce the amount of risk and to make sure that people who are qualified to be artisans who make shoes or whatever actually know how to do the thing it is that they do, right? All of those things are going to drive the economic system. On top of that, the other thing that allows them to be economically powerful is that they have inventions that other people don't have, right? But it's the combination of all of that together that makes them much more economically powerful, right? Let's see. What causes the Song Dynasty to fail? Mongol invasion, right? When does this occur? Starts in the 1260s under Kublai Khan, but it's complete by 1279. How do Neo-Confucianists differ from Confucianists? You've already mentioned the thing about women, right? Stricter. Foot binding, xenophobic, more focused on China and not really caring about anything that happens outside of China. Whereas Confucianists were much more tolerant, open to other ideas generally, right? They're not going to be open to new ideas. Junks and flying money, that's already on there. Foot binding, you got that. What does it do to the status of women?
Lowers.
It declines, right? All right, so we have this Chinese monolith, right? It's very, very powerful, and everybody around China, it's very hard for them not to be influenced by China, right? So we have China, but then we also have Japan, we have Vietnam, or Nam Viet, land to the south, Korea, and eventually in the Ming Dynasty we're going to add Tibet to this list. But for right now, it's basically Japan, Vietnam, and Korea on the test, right? Which one is the most excited about becoming more like China? Japan. Which one hates the idea the most and doesn't want to see Confucianism coming? That's Vietnam. Who kind of says, yeah, we get it, you're more powerful, we accept. Yeah, that's Korea. Tibet's a little bit more resistant. If you had to make a comparison between Tibet and the other ones, I would say Tibet and Vietnam would probably be pretty close. But Japan even gets to a point where they want to distance a little bit, right? There's a couple 100-year period where they're very active about borrowing or becoming Sinified, right? If you want to use the term. So they are active borrowers, and then they kind of distance. And once they start to distance from China, the emperor gets less powerful, and who begins to take up some of that power? As the emperor in Japan goes down, who rises in status? Shoguns, right? Military leaders. Let's say military leaders first, because the shogunate won't show up until later. But the samurai, the bushi, the military, right? Eventually, when there's one military leader for all of Japan, you have shogunate, right? We're moving in that direction, but we don't instantly go to shogunates from having an emperor. And there's still an emperor around after that. It's just that he becomes a figurehead. right? He would be a lot like the Queen of England today. She goes out, makes a lot of appearances, but she doesn't make laws, right? Sinification is the extensive adoption of Chinese culture. Tribute system is what all of these participated in at one point or another with China, where they give a gift to China each year. A big gift, like lots of silver, lots of gold, or things that are made in their kingdom. And because of that, China then decides to trade with them and benefit them in other ways, to recognize them, right? And it's a way of establishing a hierarchy where China is on top, right? And China controls and dictates what happens in these other places, which makes it easier to influence them, right? The Tale of Genji. Which one of these created the Tale of Genji? Which culture? Japan. So Japan borrowed ideas from China, and then they took those ideas and they made something new that never had existed before. It's the very first novel in history. So, as that's happening here in the Song Dynasty, what begins to happen in the Yuan Dynasty, because Japan, Lady Murasaki is actually the lady's name, because she writes the first novel, what begins to happen in China in the Yuan Dynasty? They what? They begin writing their novels, right? But they're not the first, but they're taking an idea that they set up, this whole idea of printing and the structure of language and so on, which they gave to Japan. Japan did something new with it, and then that idea is now floating back into China, right? So you're starting to see this, like, this ebb and flow back and forth between China and Japan. One of the reasons for the Taika reforms, Japan wanted to become almost exactly like, or a mirror copy of China. They were very successful. They changed the name of the emperor in Japan to a son of heaven, which is a takeoff of the mandate of heaven. But they stopped in around the 850s. So sometime during the Tang Dynasty, they said, okay, maybe we're becoming too much like the Chinese and we need to slow down a bit. And so in the 850s, you get the military-style governments. And by about the end of the Song Dynasty, you're beginning to see the shogunates show up, okay, in Japan. Who are the Trung sisters? First of all, which civilization are they a part of? Vietnam. And they do not want to see what come to their kingdom. They don't want to see Chinese ideas, especially Confucianism, especially Neo-Confucianism, right? Because the last thing they want are their feet to be 5 sizes too small. Trung sisters. Trung.
With a G.
Yes, with a G. T-R-U-N-G. Sorry. Okay, Temujin's rise to power. Was it easy for him to rise up and become, did he have a father that helped him? No, right? Had to do all of it on his own. He did it in the steppes of Asia. He did it almost having died when he was 9. He did it by developing loyalties and developing tribal alliances. Eventually, he was born, though, obviously in the steppes of Mongolia. What type of lifestyle do the Mongols lead? Semi-nomadic is technically better answer than nomadic. They don't just wander around randomly. They go between 2 spots, which means they are semi-nomadic. But they are also pastoral, which means they don't really domesticate plants, but animals more, right? Sheep, goats, yaks, reindeer even in some parts, but also horses. You have all the terms in your packet. Any of those that you just don't recognize? I think we went through those pretty much in class. What groups and regions did Genghis Khan attack? Pretty much in order. He attacked other Mongol tribes first, right? He got the Karyots and the Naimans and all those different groups. Then who does he attack? Once he's got essentially Mongol people on his side. Not Russia yet.
China.
Yeah, not China yet, but who's in northern China that's not Chinese? Tanguts and the Jin, right? These are nomadic peoples who, while they're not Mongols, are more likely to support what Genghis is trying to do, right? So he attacks other Mongol tribes, then he attacks the Tangut and the Jin, and in the movie you saw him sitting in a Tangut prison cell because he did get captured and he got free, right? Went back and got his wife. Then who does he attack? Not Russia yet. Not China yet. The guy who made him mad, cut off the heads of his ambassadors. Persia, right? Muhammad Shah. So we got other Mongols. We have the Tanguts. We have the Jin. We have Persia. Then we have China. And what happens? Genghis is getting everything ready to attack northern China, and he
Dies.
dies, right? So they break it up into four khanates with 4 leaders, 4 khans, and that's when you start to see attacks on Russia, Central Asia, China, and eventually places like Japan and Korea. But if you think about it, it makes sense. Attack the people who are more like you, get them to join your army so you have a bigger army so that when you take on these bigger foes, you will have a large enough army to withstand losing a few of those soldiers in battle, right? You got to start where you're at and then move out from there, right? Sorry, am I anyway? How did the Mongols affect Russia? What happens to Kiev?
Doesn't it just disappear?
Yeah, basically people leave the city, Kiev drops in status, the princes have to get together and join together, and they get together in Moscow, which makes Moscow kind of the de facto government, and Moscow becomes a more important city in Russia than Kiev. The trade network also changes, because if you're now part of Pax Mongolica, you will not trade with the Byzantines as much. So a north-south trading network with them is kind of out of the question. So who do you start to trade with more? If you're part of the Mongol orbit. China, right? You start to trade with Central Asia and China because that's what's being promoted by the Mongols, is this long-distance trade, Pax Mongolica via the Silk Road.
Wait, so the Mongols promoted Pax Mongolica?
The what?
Did the Mongols promote Pax
Oh, yeah.
Mongolica?
Didn't they want to promote peace and stability so that more people would trade and they could collect more tribute and tax? Mongols are defeated in 1260 at a place called Ain Jalut near Egypt. And then in 1380 they are defeated by the Russians or the Kievan Rus people at the Battle of Kulakova. So they're about 120 years apart, but these are some of the only defeats that the Mongols truly suffer until the end. Kulakova is Russia,
What year?
1380. So 1260 and 1380. Those are not dates you have to memorize, though. It's not on your list, right?
X amount, right?
Status of women in Mongol culture versus Chinese culture, higher or lower?
Higher.
Higher, right? Because to live that kind of lifestyle, you would not allow your feet to be bound. You wouldn't accept restrictions. You wouldn't limit yourself to the household. What social groups benefited from the Mongol takeover? Merchants rose in status. Artisans rose in status. Scholars rose in status. Although scholars were always respected, but nothing happens to them if they get a little bit stronger. But also artists, the mean people, the people who have to wear the green scarves. They do not have to wear the green scarves, and that is a change because we've seen that Confucianists really don't like the people who are considered leeches on society. Who doesn't benefit from the Mongol takeover?
Bureaucrats.
Bureaucrats, right? Because they don't trust the Chinese to be in upper levels of government, so if you're a high-level ranking bureaucrat, you're pretty much out of a job. They're going to bring in Marco Polo and Muslim merchants and people from Central Asia and Persia and places like that to be upper-level bureaucrats, right? So that's probably the group that takes the biggest hit, right? What is Kublai Khan's dynasty known as? Yuan dynasty. Various voyages of exploration. You should know Columbus, Diaz de Gama, Magellan, and I think, the exploration map we did in class. And then also Zheng He. I think you need to treat him as an explorer, even though he's technically not an explorer. So those, go back and take a look at your map. The Vikings were a group who made it to the New World by around 1,000. Basque and Bristol fishermen were the ones who were going farther and farther out into the ocean. So over here in northern Spain and coming off the coast of England, you had fishermen who would go out maybe this far looking for fish, right? Why did Europe need so much fish?
Because there were so many people.
They were
Population's
Catholic.
growing, but they're a particular kind of
They were
people.
Catholic.
They were Catholic, and what do Catholics eat on Friday?
Oh,
Fish.
I knew that.
Yeah. Now, as this area gets fished out, what do the fishermen do? They go a little farther. And when that gets fished out, they go a little farther. And by the 1460s, they've already probably found the New World. Are they going to come home? Are these Basque fishermen and these Bristol fishermen going to come home and celebrate the fact they found this new territory? No, because they don't want people coming and taking their fishing territory, right? So Columbus gets credit for a lot of stuff, but he's not the first, right? Obviously, you need to know about Columbus. I'm not worried about that. Cabot, you can cross off for right now. We're not going to look at England's desire for the New World until later. Prince Henry is the guy in Portugal who starts a school, teaches navigators how to navigate on the ocean, but he never really goes out on expeditions of his own. He's not a captain or a sailor. He's a guy who teaches other people how to be captains and sailors. Diaz and da Gama both would like to go where? India, right? Which one makes it to India? Da Gama. And then Zheng He is kind of the Chinese Columbus, but he's so much greater, right? Who ended the Starfleet missions? Neo-Confucianists who didn't care about what was going on outside of China. Who burned all the records? They wanted to make sure nobody else tried to do what Zheng He had done. So they were trying to close off China. They were trying to wall off China so that it would not be affected by the outer world. Why did the Renaissance begin in Italy? All the city-states in Italy had more of a connection to where than the rest of Europe? China. And Asia, and India, and the Muslim world too, for that matter, right? The Renaissance begins in Italy because there's excess money, they're making profit off of trade, and they have connection to the ideas that come to them from Southernization, right? What other parts of the world have had a Renaissance before? In order. No, not China first. China's second, India first, then China, then the Muslim world, then Europe. That's Southernization, right? That's the thesis of Southernization. Elements of the European Renaissance. Artistic creativity and innovation. A rise in finance, a rise in wealth that spreads throughout Europe. A secular look at things, which is non-religious way to look at things. A glorification of Greek and Roman styles of art and philosophy and government. And why would I kill if you brought me a Waldseemüller map?
Because there's only
three.
Well, it's more than that, but yes, there are only three.
Oh, it's the first map of America.
First one, it's not the first map of America, it's the first one to use the word America. Slight distinction, but it actually uses the word America. That's the word that becomes associated with the two new continents eventually. All right. So, in the AP exam, they are going to go off what are called these key concepts. So I provided some, and what you need to be able to do is think of examples of these things, right? So provide an example of improved transportation technologies or commercial practices that led to an increased volume of trade. You've already done it, but let's summarize it. What did the Chinese do in order to increase trade? Chinese junks, flying money, guilds, right? In Europe, what did they do to increase trade?
exploration.
Okay, exploration and colonization. Finance, right? Leonardo and the Medici family switch over from Roman numerals to Hindu-Arabic numerals. Begin to not just let the Jews be the money lenders, but actually create a banking system that will support larger amounts of trade. So those are just two examples. A commercial practice you might argue is Pax Mongolica. If you make it peaceful enough for people to travel long distances, they will do that and they will trade more, and that's essentially what the Mongols did. But that's different than what China and Europe did in order to increase trade, right? The Mongols just got the barriers of bandits and scary people out of the way, right? They made it safe to go long distances. Provide an example of how trade networks depended upon environmental knowledge. Why did nobody go to China before Marco Polo? Why is he the first guy? They didn't know where it was, right? Until somebody went, and then what happened after Marco Polo? Everybody and their dog wanted to go to China, right? Everybody and their frou-frou dog. Environmental knowledge. What did Columbus expose as the best way to get from Europe to the Americas?
Atlantic.
Circular trade wind patterns, right? And how to follow those. How did Indian merchants become the middlemen of the world? Because of their knowledge of... Yeah, but more specifically, what allowed Indian merchants to travel both to Africa and China? Monsoon winds, right? All of those are examples of that. And if you were ever asked to compare those, you should be able to pull those up and be able to kind of think about the differences between those kinds of things. Provide an example of how increased cross-cultural examples, sounds like an essay, resulted in the diffusion of literary, artistic, and cultural traditions. This one I think is easy, but maybe not. Key concept 3.1, number 3. Provide an example of how increased cross-cultural examples resulted in a diffusion of literary, artistic, and cultural traditions. What?
Oh, yeah.
Pax Mongolica? I'll buy that, but I wanted something more specific than that.
Arabic numerals.
What?
Concept is 0.
Arabic numerals.
Is that a literary, artistic, or cultural tradition?
Oh.
In what way? Give me a specific example of Southernization that's literary, artistic, or cultural.
I would have to think about that.
Okay, well, think about it. Come back.
This is the Japanese writing.
Thank you. Right? China gives Japan a style of writing that they can use. Japan creates the novel, right? And then what happens in China when the Mongols support scholars and writers? They start writing novels too, right? And you have an artistic tradition that develops over time. Where did Europeans during the Renaissance get ideas for how to make sculpture and painting? Some of it was new, but some of it was a little bit, but I think Greek and Roman's really the bigger, because they were trying to go back to the Greek and Roman examples, and the only reason they knew what those Greek and Roman examples were is because of the Crusades allowing texts and books to come out of the Muslim world back into the European world. And then when they got all these new ideas, they're like, oh, well, let's look in here and see what the Greeks thought about, plagues and all of those things, right? And so that would be an example of cross-cultural borrowing that led to all that. Provide an example of an empire that collapsed and was reconstituted. Did the Han Dynasty collapse?
Yes.
How was the Sui Dynasty different than the Han Dynasty? Ming's not until much later. Okay, they had to reestablish, so in some ways they wanted to do the exact same thing as the Han Dynasty, right? They wanted a single emperor. But what was Wendy willing to do that the Han would never have considered? Go with the nomads, right? But eventually he got overruled. But in government, what was a new idea that emerged that changed the way that the government and the people interacted with each